This is Facepalm America. I'm Beowulf Rockland. Facepalm America is where you can find out more information about the program, listen to past episodes, and connect with us on social media. All sorts of good stuff like that. The group Equal Citizens was founded by Harvard law professor Lawrence Lessig, and it has done a very good job of campaigning to get SuperPACs regulated. You probably know what a SuperPAC is, and Professor Lessig can go into it in more detail here in a moment. But basically, the way I envision it is a big black hole into which very wealthy individuals or corporations or groups can pour tons and tons of money, basically unlimited amounts, with no one really knowing who they are, in order to influence political campaigns in the United States of America. And it really has been a blight on the political landscape, especially in the wake of 2010 and the Citizens United decision. So they've come up with a way, Equal Citizens has, to promote why super PACs should be regulated. And we're very pleased to have Lawrence Lessig with us today. Professor Lessig, thank you so much for being with us on Facepalm America.
Thanks for having me.
So remind us what happened in 2010 with Citizens United and just how that opened the floodgates for the sort of thing that you're trying to get under control now.
Yeah, so two things happened. One is not very surprising, and one was pretty astonishing. So the not surprising one was the decision of the Supreme Court in Citizens United, which said that if you are spending money independently of a campaign, it doesn't matter whether you're a corporation, a union, a political action committee, or just a rich person, you're allowed to do that to an unlimited extent, again, so long as you don't coordinate with the campaign. And the reason for that is the only grounds the Supreme Court has offered for regulating political speech is the risk of, or the appearance of the risk of, quid pro quo corruption, this for that corruption. And the basic reasoning was, if you're independent, that means by definition, there's no chance for a quid pro quo deal. So therefore, speech independently of a campaign cannot be constitutionally limited. That's Citizens United. Okay, again, I don't think that was terribly surprising, although it terrified a lot of us when it came down. But what was really surprising was a decision by the D.C. Circuit just a couple months later. So the D.C. Circuit is the Court of Appeals over the District of Columbia. It's kind of the king of the circuits, the one that's most respected, perhaps, of all the circuits. And what that court held was, if you can't limit expenditures by independent political action committees, because there's no risk of quid pro quo corruption, it follows, as a matter of logic, as they said, as a matter of law, we don't have to know any facts at all, just we know, they said, that you can't limit contributions to a political action committee, which is engaged in independent political speech. Now, that conclusion is just logically, obviously wrong, just completely obviously wrong. And yet the court made it, and the government decided not to try to appeal it because they didn't actually think this was going to be an important problem. But what that decision established in 2010 was the super PAC, because what that decision basically said is you can contribute unlimited amounts of money to these independent political action committees, and they can then spend it independently, and none of it can be restricted under the First Amendment. And that's the decision that we think is just obviously fallacious. And because of that fallacious decision, we have lived for 13 years with these unbelievably corrupting institutions, super PACs, affecting every level of our political system, including the selection of Supreme Court justices.
So this, given what has happened in the past 13 years since that decision, and given the amount of money that poured into the system, and given the influence that that has indeed had on all levels of government, including the Supreme Court, and given the composition of the Supreme Court as a result at the moment, now would not necessarily seem like the most propitious time to go to the Supreme Court, if such a thing were possible legally, and say, hey, let's revisit this. Let's talk about whether that was actually a good decision or not. So what's the difference between that path and the path of reform that you are proposing?
Well, I want to actually push back a little bit on the first assumption you just made.
Fair enough.
Because again, importantly, the United States Supreme Court has never addressed this question. It's never taken a case and decided whether contributions to an independent political action committee can be regulated. And my belief is that when it gets a chance to hear that question, applying its existing jurisprudence, which says that if and only if there's a risk of quid pro quo corruption, can contributions be limited? Applying that very narrow conception of corruption. My belief is the court will 7-2, maybe unanimously if the originalists apply an originalist methodology, 7-2 at least, say that, yeah, of course, you can regulate contributions to independent political action committees. So I actually think that this court is, in fact, eager to demonstrate that they're not just a bunch of political hacks. They've got some principles. Those principles tend to lean towards conservative causes. But as Justice Gorsuch has demonstrated again and again, when they lean to the liberal side, they're happy to apply the same principles. Now, people are skeptical of that. I get that. And people look at the court and they think they're just a bunch of political hacks. I actually don't think that's true. I don't think they're a bunch of political hacks in this sense. And so I'm actually very optimistic that if we get this case to the court will rule in our favor. So the question is, how do we get the case to the court? And we tried this argument that I want to, let me give it, let me lay it out. But the argument was actually developed by my colleague, Larry Tribe, my former law professor, Al Alschuler, Free Speech for People, which is a really fantastic organization of lawyers that have been pressing a lot of legal issues around democracy, are the ones that first deployed this argument. But what we saw when Free Speech for People tried to deploy this argument in Massachusetts last year to allow us in Massachusetts to have an initiative that would limit contributions to independent expenditure committees, what we found was that the lawyers, both at the Attorney General offices and also on the Supreme Judicial Court, just took it as obvious, just thought it was like a settled question, that there was no reason to even think about it. And they treated it as kind of crazy talk that anybody would today be challenging the question of whether super PACs can be regulated. And that led us at Equal Citizens to think, wow, we've got some work to do to kind of break up the ground here to make it possible for people to even think about the question. So that's why we decided we were going to create this video competition. We first crowdfunded a really large prize, a $50,000 prize, and we're continuing to collect money to make it even go higher. And the prize is for someone who will take the essence of the argument that Free Speech for People made and render it in a video form that's short and compelling and just unavoidably clear, so that we can begin to spread this understanding and kind of make it obvious, kind of second nature, that every lawyer would say, yeah, of course this decision is wrong. We just have to find a way to correct it. So to do that, I wrote this kind of, hideously long for the internet video. It's a 12-minute long video that takes goes the argument step by step to sort of show what the mistake in in Speech Now was. And then based on that stem file, we're inviting people to remix it, make a new version, make a version that's even more compelling, more obvious, so that, our hope is we're going to have dozens of these videos that kind of make this point, so that if you look through them by the end of like the fifth, you're like, oh my God, this is astonishing. It's a 2 + 2 = 5 like mistake that the DC Circuit made, and no court has had the courage to question the DC Circuit. And if you fix that mistake, if we get 2 + 2 = 4, then in fact, states and the federal government would be allowed to limit these ungodly corruptions to our political system.
Well, perhaps I'm too cynical, and I'm glad that there are people both in a position to do something about it and with the proper legal acumen to define specifically what this path is, who are not so cynical and are not so pessimistic. But this certainly should be tried. This absolutely, if it hasn't been pursued, let's pursue it. Let's get there, get back to a place where our political campaign finance system is somewhat reasonably in balance by any means that we have to get there. So why not try this? Absolutely. So what you're trying to do is bring lawyers into a mindset where they realize that this is even possible. And you're trying to, and I can understand why they wouldn't be, because it's kind of, one, I have always conflated the two decisions that you're talking about. Two, once something is set and you kind of, oh great, this is awful, you just kind of like go with that, and you're less able to see other options. But you've defined a particular option here, and you want people to basically, as I understand it, take your kind of clunky video, which I was watching a little bit of, make this better and open the minds of not even the general public, but a few select attorneys who might be in a position to do something about it, so that they will carry the ball and bring this to the Supreme Court to see if this might work.
Yeah. So, I mean, you started by saying you probably know what a super PAC is.
Yeah.
So our target is everybody who knows what the word super PAC means.
Okay.
So obviously that's a bunch of lawyers. It's a bunch of judges. It's a bunch of members of Congress and every other legislative body in America. It's also a bunch of like political activists. It's people who look at political campaigns and think, my gosh, in our state, the super PAC is spending twice as much money as the candidate is spending to get elected or to stop the other guy from getting elected. It's basically everybody who's awake to the basic system of corruption that is our political campaign finance system right now. Now, so that's a lot of people. And so we want that group of people to kind of develop an awareness that this is not just not settled. This is just wrong. It's just clearly wrong. And the point you just made about your conflating two decisions. Look, it's excusable. You're not a constitutional lawyer. What astonished me when I was watching this argument, participating in the Supreme Judicial Court, is that the Attorney General of Massachusetts has this conflation too. And the judges on the Supreme Judicial Court kept on saying, I read Citizens United, and Citizens United seems to say, and we're like, Your Honors, this has nothing to do with Citizens United. Citizens United was about contribution, about expenditures. Right. And we're not saying there's anything wrong with that ruling. Indeed, from the logic of quid pro quo corruption, it makes perfect sense. We might not like it. Like I, as an individual citizen, would rather a different system. Like I'm totally happy to acknowledge I don't like it, but I think it is right under the law as the Supreme Court has articulated.
Right.
But this is not about expenditures. This is about contributions. And what the court has said is if a contribution raises the threat of quid pro quo corruption, it can be regulated. So here's why it's so obvious. Okay, so when the DC Circuit decided the case and thought about contributions, what they were thinking about is some rich guy talking to an independent political action committee and saying to the independent political action committee, look, I'll give you $1 million if you run a bunch of ads about, some widget bill. Right. And the committee says, sure, we'll do that. Now that's quid pro quo, but it's quid pro quo between the committee and the donor. And that's not the kind of corruption that the Supreme Court has said can be regulated by Congress. So if you think that's the only way in which a donation happens, yes, speech now is correct. But just 3 years ago, or now it's 2018, there was a prosecution of Senator Robert Menendez from New Jersey. And the claim in that prosecution, the jury ultimately found Menendez innocent, but the claim in that prosecution was that a rich guy had come to Menendez and said to Menendez, look, I'll contribute to your super PAC if you will do the following things for me. So that's classic quid pro quo. Right. That's classic corruption. Mm-hmm. But it involved a contribution to a political action committee.
Right.
So the thing which the DC Circuit said was logically impossible, quid pro quo corruption with a donation to a super PAC, actually was alleged and prosecuted by the DOJ as actually happening. So when you see